This is Deep Down, and I'm your host, Jordan Hunt. I'm a composer, vocalist, multi-instrumentalist, and self-releasing artist. You might also know me as former violinist in The Irrepressibles, as the long-standing musical companion to Grammy-nominated Olivia Chaney, or as a musical and associate director of the Theo Adams Company. I delve deep as we explore the creative process and life through the lens of a musician, unraveling universal ideas and enigmas through some of my songs and lyrics, and through some of the profound moments that have shaped me. Join me deep down as we embark on this journey together, in search of answers to the elusive question, what do you really feel deep down? In this episode, I take a deep dive into my most recent release, The 3 Visions for Solo Violin, one of my most intense compositions so far. I delve deep into the music and provide some background and context to how and why I wrote it, and share the influences behind it. I reveal just how difficult it was to write, facing my fears as a less-than-virtuosic violinist. And for such a short piece, this recording was literally years in the making, an epic labour of love. So join me in this special deep dive episode of Deep Down. Welcome, listeners. Back in my first episode, I talked about the pain of starting again. And in some ways, this piece, The 3 Visions, is representative of a fresh start for me. For those of you who haven't heard it, it's a work for solo violin with no accompaniment, and it's in 10 short movements totaling around 17 minutes, which, let me tell you, it's quite the undertaking, even though it's only for one instrument. This is actually my most recent release. In fact, I released it in June last year, 2023. So it feels wise to delve deeper while the feeling is relatively fresh, because my memory is terrible. I mentioned it felt a little like starting again, because although violin is my first instrument, until I'd written this work, I'd never actually written for solo violin before in all my 20-odd years as a composer. I always thought it to be an incredibly daunting task, not least because of the sheer amount of incredible music for solo violin that precedes me. And because, does the world even need a new piece for solo violin with all the masterpieces out there? I keep mentioning in previous episodes that I think of myself as an essentialist rather than a minimalist. It's definitely not an aesthetic choice, more of an existential crisis in sheep's clothing. But it's also incredibly daunting because I've never thought very highly of myself as a violinist. I had and have serious imposter syndrome, probably because I'm not as good as Hilary Hahn, who is, in my humble opinion, possibly the best violinist in the world alive today. And no matter how many thousands of hours I practice from this day forward, I'll still never be that good. But we move on, got to get over it, otherwise I wouldn't do anything ever again. So the violin, besides having huge expressive potential and huge virtuosic potential, is not actually a very natural choice for a solo work because it's a monodic instrument. In other words, it's designed to play one note at once. And you can manage some stabby, short 3 or 4 note chords if you're lucky. I mean, it's ideal at playing beautiful melodies, but melodies alone can feel a bit lonely and bare. It can actually play 2 strings at the same time, and if you're incredibly controlled and well practiced, you can play 2 melodies at once on adjacent strings, though it's very difficult to make those 2 strings do 2 different lines of music in true counterpoint. And due to its design, any more notes than that, it's a bit of a compromise. It's just not really built for fistfuls of chords like the piano, and it can't sustain chords of many notes beautifully like the piano, which has the sustain pedal. So, as one mentor once said to me, it's not the most forgiving solo instrument to listen to. And I found in my music, and my songs especially, that I want to envelop the listener in a world, which is a mighty difficult task for a tiny instrument like the violin to do. I guess that's why the violin is often accompanied by a piano or an orchestra or a quartet of strings. So you might understand why the idea of composing for violin put the chills down my spine and why I'd avoided it for so long, because being a violinist, I knew just how hard it was to do well. And at the same time, some 20 or so years down the road, since graduating from music college as a composer, my musical style has developed a lot. I've been in bands and started writing songs and listening to different music that's not even legal at classical music college. Obviously, that's a joke, but not really. And I have a totally different relationship with the instrument now than when I did when I had my last lessons, aged around 20. Suffice to say that the prospect of writing for the violin really felt like starting over. And dangerous and daunting as it seemed, it was quite exciting, though, the opportunity to reinvent the way I wrote classical music, in inverted commas, potentially for an audience that didn't listen to classical music, but rather listened to the songs I'd released, plus whichever metal rock bands the algorithm pointed them to next. It is a little terrifying, putting your neck on the line, artistically speaking, and suddenly releasing a 17-minute classical EP of solo violin music, after releasing what is essentially a bunch of pop songs. Would it not get confusing, etc.? Of course, I had to trust that people are quite capable of choosing whatever music they wanted to, and it wasn't in my control whether they listened to my music or not. All I can do is write the best music I can and then share it, which is what I did. Although it was quite a slog to get to this point, some 5 years after its conception. I'll tell you a bit about the backstory of the three visions. So my partner, Christopher Thomas, is an incredible choreographer, and he was very lucky to be on the Sadler's Wells Young Associate Scheme and had the opportunity to create and present 2 new contemporary dance works over a 2-year period on the hallowed stages at Sadler's Wells, and so it seemed a natural fit, a fit of nepotism perhaps, that I might attempt to provide the soundtrack to this event. Of course, as is the case in the arts en masse, however prestigious the venue, there was next to no budget for players for live performance. But that definitely felt like one of the more exciting routes to go down, to have live music, to accompany the live dance of this small ensemble cast of 3 dancers, rather than making a pre-recorded backing track. And that's how we ended up with the instrumentation of solo violin, because that's what we could afford. And I'm nothing if not practical. The story that Chris came up with was one of a woman who meets 3 visions, hence the title, one of herself as a child, one of her mother, and one is a vision of the child she'll never have. It's all very spooky, which is definitely his vibe. So broadly speaking, the piece was to be in 3 sections, which is how the music is also structured. And I decided to add a framing prologue and epilogue to set and close the scene. That was the opening of the prologue. It's a tentative and wandering representation of a mind lost deep in thought. Also, I hope that's what it conveys. The protagonist of the show, seated at her dressing table, looking at her reflection in the mirror. And in order to structure my musical thoughts so that it didn't turn into a rambling stream of consciousness for the listener, I turned to Bach, because, to be fair, he already did it much better than I could ever dream of doing it. If you're familiar with Bach's solo violin music, you may hear his influence in some of the preceding movements, and to be honest, his influence is in the DNA of this piece, because he explored so thoroughly the instrument as a solo vehicle for sustaining musical ideas on a monumental scale. He managed to achieve what nobody had even attempted before, and to suggest that this one little instrument was actually 4 separate voices singing at the same time. And of course, as I mentioned, that is short of impossible on this effectively monodic melodic instrument, but somehow he allows the ear to fill in the gaps in the arrangement. Rather than playing all 3 or 4 notes of a chord at the same time, he spreads them out in a little arpeggio, and the ear hears it as one chord. It's actually phenomenal how the ear interprets harmony in that way. And if you listen to his famous Prelude in C for keyboard or the cello partitur in G, you'll hear this effect of arpeggiating a chord, almost like spinning thread on a spinning wheel. And the ear creates the most harmonious effect. It's really something. So being deeply indebted, I stole that idea and made it my own. And we can hear that influence in the closing epilogue too. Now you may start to hear the connection between the opening movement and the closing movement, and that's because underneath the meandering melody of the opening lies a chord sequence almost secreted away, and that is revealed more fully in variation in this final framing epilogue. And this idea of variation is the principal thread that runs throughout the 10 movements, with the exception of 1 or 2, which go a little off-piste for dramatic effect. So after our opening prologue, we hear Double, and Double, the title of the second track, is a play on words, as it's the first time we see a second character on stage, and as I explained in Chris's idea for the story, this second dancer is in fact the younger version of the protagonist, or her double, so to speak. Musically, however, it's also got another function, borrowing the form from the Baroque variation technique of being a quicker paced harmonic double of the previous movement, which is what's going on here. Behind the scenes, this second movement is literally a double of the first, with twice as many notes and oscillations, which on the surface move twice as quickly, but underneath the harmonic speed is moving at exactly the same speed as the opening. I'm probably too clever for my own good, but it was effective in the show to just change up the mood from the rather somber opening. So now we're in the midst of the first vision, the younger self, and so follows Youth, the third movement, which is another similar variation on the original progression, this time with a bit more artistic license, and a light little harmonic effect as the dancers playfully stop in their tracks. And by harmonic, in this context, I mean the high-pitched, pure, icy note you hear, a bit like a whistle tone. This youthful vision ends with hope, which, musically speaking, is more of a punctuation. It feels like an almost endless loop of the same 5 chords, swirling around like a little tornado, starting soft and sparkling, and building to a rousing crescendo. I don't have too much to say about it because musically there's not that much going on. vanishing almost as quickly as it started, we arrive in a new barren landscape, taking us into Loss, the fifth track. And here a second vision appears, facing an image of herself, dealing with the painful emotions of mourning the child she'll never have. And I have to be honest, this was one of the most difficult movements to write, as it's just so sad. You can hear the music is strained and painful, and maybe you can even recognise it as a histrionic variation of the opening prelude. It's very high on the violin, and it doesn't have the depth or richness of the lower strings. It's quite a shrill sound when played solo with no accompaniment, and that was no accident. It's probably the most intensely piercing movement. The first half's a little resigned to loss, and then with little variation, the second half, with this insistent melody, keeps reaching out for more. It's very desperate in its longing, and as the movement comes to a close, the repetition is almost like a mantra, turning inwards introspectively as it tries to gather itself together. It's followed by Trio, which is probably the most formal of all the movements and the closest pastiche to a Baroque trio movement, which usually has 3 beats per bar like this does. And here it's almost as though the violin has split itself into 3 different musical ideas. The melodic top line, with the oscillating notes, which is a direct continuation from Loss, only now an octave lower, a harmony played just below in double stops, and then an intermittent lower note, almost like a bass line, played by a cello, which leads the change in harmony. Rhythmically, it's very repetitive, and traditionally a trio was a dance form, so was limited to certain rhythmic constraints to fulfill its functional role as an accompaniment to dance. Here, it's a representation of repression, where the main character is trying to repress the feelings of loss into some sort of structure, tidying the feelings away into a stricter format. And of course on stage, by this scene, there's also a literal trio of dancers. This is followed by possibly the most melancholic movement, Despair. Our main character has felt the first wave of grief in Loss and has tried to squash those feelings aside and carry on in the trio. But finally she gives into this heartbreaking despair, and at the lowest ebb, with nothing to lose, there's a sense of giving up, with nothing left to live for. It's the first time since the wild flurries of hope just a few movements before that the music has gone so off-piste. And whilst we're still in the same sound world, the harmonic thread to the opening theme is at its loosest here, more of a meandering, aimless depression of slumping forwards to an inevitable end, represented by a simple melody of slurring, falling scales with no apparent course. We're left at the end hanging on an unresolved precipice, the mood totally dispelled by the following movement, impassioned realization of anger. It's the loudest, fullest, most strident movement with double, triple, and quadruple stopped chords, meaning the violin is attempting to achieve the impossible and sustain more than two notes at once. In a moment of extreme clarity and focus, it's the most distilled version of the opening chord sequence we'll hear, and leads to our penultimate movement, the most substantial of all 10 movements, the Reckoning, which begins with a livid, almost insane oscillation. Mirroring the second movement, Double, it feels almost double that speed again, played with a crazed, whispery dynamic as though the protagonist is mumbling to herself at 100 miles per hour, and it evokes that beautiful Arthur Russell sound on the cello. The bow on the violin is sul ponticello, meaning on the bridge, which gives a discomforting, icy feeling and sound, and it's almost like Rumpelstiltskin at the spinning wheel in a perpetual motion, keeping an unbroken thread of notes afloat and ever-changing and evolving into even more complex patterns, using the same chord sequence over and over again, with each repetition an attempt to perfect the last version, but also becoming more and more chaotic as the mind unravels, culminating in a final spinning of all the chords with the bow flying across the strings. Consciously echoing the dance to the death at the finale of the classic film Red Shoes, the dancer collapses in a fit of exhaustion, overwhelmed by this blizzard of notes she just encountered, ready to face the final moments as she returns to her opening position at her dressing table as the closing, framing epilogue brings the performance and the suite to its reticent end. And that brings us to the close of the 3 visions for solo violin, performed by myself, Jordan Hunt, recorded at the Menuhin Hall by Bobby Williams, and it was written for Christopher Thomas's contemporary dance piece of the same name, which premiered at Sadler's Wells Theatre in London back in 2018. And if you've made it this far, I think you deserve a strong G&T, because that was a lot. I feel like I've been at school myself, and I almost forgot how much thought and detail went into writing this piece. And a similar amount of work went into the totally exquisite artwork by my friend Thomas Warham, who's a fine artist and a friend I've known for a long time, who hand-dyed maybe 50 different sheets of paper and marbled paper, and screen-printed an image of me that he'd taken and photoshopped into this sort of ghostly totem floating there like a vision onto all of these different papers to try and find the one with the right vibe. And I think the vibe we went for in the end, if you've seen the artwork, is sort of elegant intestines. It's reminding me just how much work has gone into this project and how my wonderful friend, the musician Bobby Williams, recorded me playing the violin at the Menuhin Hall all those years ago. And because I happened to be suffering from terrible neck pain on the day, I kept having to stop and retake sections. So his job in the edit was made all the more difficult with this Frankenstein job of patchworking together my best attempts at a Hilary Hahn impersonation. And part of me didn't want to share with you that that was a process of recording, because I'd love to be that girl who just nailed it first time and won a Grammy for it. Alas, that didn't happen. But I always remember buying this CD of Nigel Kennedy's when I was a teenager, back in the 90s, with a gift token I'd won for being a SWAT in music class. He's a phenomenal violinist too, if you don't know him. It was his Chrysler CD, and back in the late 90s with no Spotify and a shockingly small record collection, I listened to that CD so many times. I really adored the music and the playing, and then one day I noticed in the liner notes a little asterisk. So I followed to find the other asterisk to see what all the fuss was about, and it said very proudly that the last track was a live recording. And I thought, what? You mean to say that the rest of the CD wasn't a live recording? And I didn't even understand what he meant by that for a while. I couldn't believe it. But it finally dawned on me that via the magic of the studio, the rest of the CD was also a Frankenstein job of his best takes. And in the case of the final track, he deemed it worthy as a single take to be used in full, and was so proud of the fact that he even mentioned it in the CD liner notes. So, if you ever need consoling for having had a sore neck and forking out hundreds of pounds on a non-refundable recording location named after one of the planet's most famous violinists, rest assured that a patchwork job in post-production is good enough for Nigel, so it's good enough for me. I think that's enough for now. Thank you so much for listening to this special deep dive episode of Deep Down. It's been such a pleasure to revisit the composition of the 3 visions for solo violin and to give you a glimpse of how it was conceived and written, and to remind me just how much work I can get done when I put my mind to it. I need a cup of tea now just thinking about it. If you haven't heard it already, go listen in full on one of the streaming services or buy a copy from my website. Thank you so much. Don't forget to subscribe, follow, and review this podcast. And if you like it, share it with your friends or on social media. You can find me on all social platforms by searching at Jordan Hunt Music, and you can listen to my music on all good streaming services. Deep Down uses bits of my music nabbed from my songs Ocean Floor and Peter. Check out the show notes on jordan-hunt.com for exclusive tidbits from this podcast. I'd really love to hear from you via DM or email via my website if any of these experiences resonated with you, and if you have questions, suggestions, or requests for future episodes. Thank you so much for listening.